My sister burst into my classroom and said, "Did you eat the brownies I baked?" "Yeah, why are you here?" I was so confused seeing her at my school. "I need to pull you out of class now." She was already grabbing my backpack off the floor. Mr. Todsworth started protesting about disrupting his lesson, but Summer just flashed her college ID and said family emergency. She practically dragged me out of my chair while my classmates stared. I'd never seen her this freaked out about anything. In the hallway, she started rapid-fire questioning me while we speed-walked toward the parking lot. How many brownies did I eat? When did I eat them? Did I feel anything weird yet? Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her car keys. "I had 3 for breakfast. They were chocolate fudge, right?" I was trying to keep up with her longer legs. Summer made this choking sound and started walking even faster. We burst through the school doors, and I saw her car parked sideways across 2 spots with the engine still running. Her sorority sister Betsy was in the passenger seat looking stressed. "Get in. Right now." Summer shoved me into the back seat. The second I closed the door, she peeled out of the parking lot so fast the tires squealed. Betsy turned around to look at me and started laughing. Not normal laughing, but that nervous kind when something is really bad, but also kind of funny. "This is serious!" Summer smacked Betsy's arm while merging onto the highway way too fast. "What's serious? What's wrong with the brownies?" My stomach was starting to feel weird, but maybe that was just from the crazy driving. Summer's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. She kept checking the rearview mirror to look at me like she was checking if I was still alive or something. Betsy had her phone out Googling something and showing Summer the screen at red lights. "Just tell me how you feel. Any nausea? Headache? Do things look normal?" Summer's voice was getting higher. That's when I noticed the stop sign we passed looked kind of weird, like it was breathing or something. The red was really, really red. Redder than normal red. And the trees along the road were super green, like someone had turned up the saturation on everything. "Things look kind of bright, I guess?" I rubbed my eyes, but it didn't help. Betsy turned around again with this expression like she was trying not to laugh. Summer shot her a death glare and took the next exit toward the hospital. The sun through the windows made rainbow patterns on the seats that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Were those pot brownies?" I asked, even though I'd never had pot before. "It's so much worse." Summer's voice cracked. The hospital parking lot was huge, and all the white lines seemed to glow. I felt floaty getting out of the car like my legs weren't quite connected right. Summer grabbed my arm to steady me, and we walked toward the emergency entrance. Everything felt slow motion, but also too fast at the same time. Inside, the lights were so bright I had to squint. The waiting room chairs were the bluest blue I'd ever seen. A little kid's toy in the corner was making patterns when it probably wasn't supposed to. Summer was at the desk explaining something to the nurse in a low, urgent voice. "My 16-year-old brother accidentally ingested..." She whispered the rest. The nurse's eyes went wide, and she immediately called for someone to take us back. That scared me more than anything because emergency rooms never take you back fast unless it's really bad. They put me in a wheelchair even though I could walk. The hallway tiles had patterns that seemed to swirl. In the examination room, everything was too white and too bright. The blood pressure cuff felt weird on my arm like I could feel every thread in the fabric. The nurse kept asking me questions, but Summer answered most of them. Something about onset time and peak effects and how many grams. "We need to monitor him for the next several hours." The nurse was typing on her computer. "These cases can be unpredictable." Summer was crying now. Actually crying. My sister who didn't even cry when she broke her arm skateboarding. She kept apologizing and saying it was for her frat party, that they were clearly labeled and in her room where I wasn't supposed to be. The doctor came in looking serious, but also like he was trying not to smirk. He examined my pupils with a light that left trails in my vision. Asked me to follow his finger, which seemed to duplicate into 3 fingers. "So, we're looking at accidental ingestion of..." "Oh my God." He paused and looked at his chart. "Where did you get these kinds of shrooms? We need to call the police on your sister." His face kept splitting into 3 faces and merging back together while I tried to focus on what he just said about police. Summer grabbed his arm and started talking fast, begging him to wait, explaining it was an accident, and she'd take full responsibility for everything. Her voice cracked and broke, and she kept saying please over and over. The nurse who'd been typing stepped between them and suggested the doctor speak with Summer privately in the hallway. Her voice was calm but firm, like she dealt with this kind of thing all the time. They moved toward the door, and I watched their shapes blur and trail as they walked. The door closed, and I was alone in the examination room, where the walls seemed to breathe in and out slowly. The fluorescent lights above me left long trails when I blinked, and the white tiles on the floor formed patterns that definitely weren't there before. I could hear my heartbeat really loud in my ears, and the rushing sound made it hard to think straight. Through the door, I heard raised voices but couldn't make out actual words over all the noise in my head. Everything sounded underwater and far away. A different nurse came in, younger than the first one, and walked over to check my blood pressure again. She wrapped the cuff around my arm, and I felt every single thread in the fabric pressing against my skin. She asked me simple questions while the cuff squeezed tight. "What's your name? How old are you? What day is it? Do you know where you are?" I answered, but my voice sounded weird and distant like it wasn't coming from me. She wrote things down on a clipboard and kept glancing at the monitor showing my blood pressure and heart rate. The numbers on the screen glowed too bright and seemed to pulse. She asked if I felt dizzy or sick, and I nodded because my stomach was doing flips. She brought over a plastic basin and set it next to the bed just in case. The door opened again, and Summer came back in looking pale and shaken, her eyes red from crying. The doctor followed her, and his expression was serious, but not as angry as before. He explained they were required by law to file a report with social services because I'm a minor who ingested illegal drugs, but he'd document this as accidental ingestion rather than intentional distribution. His words felt heavy and important, even though they took forever to process in my foggy brain. He emphasized I needed constant supervision for the next 6 to 8 hours, while the effects peaked and then slowly went away. Summer nodded and wiped her face with her sleeve. The doctor moved to the computer and started typing, then turned back to tell Summer he was ordering lab work to confirm exactly what was in my system and check for dangerous interactions or other problems. Summer had to sign paperwork acknowledging she provided the substances and accepting legal responsibility as an adult. Her hands shook so bad she could barely hold the pen. I watched her scribble her signature on multiple pages while the doctor explained each form. The clock on the wall seemed to melt, and the hands moved in strange, jerky patterns. Time felt completely broken, like minutes were hours or maybe seconds. I couldn't tell anymore. A woman in regular clothes came in carrying a folder and introduced herself as Aaliyah Crawford. She said she was a social worker who worked with minors in crisis situations. Her voice was gentle and calm, and she had kind eyes that didn't judge. She asked Summer to step out so she could talk to me alone about what happened and how I was feeling. Summer looked at me with this desperate, worried expression before leaving the room again. Aaliyah pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down at my level instead of standing over me. She asked me to tell her what happened starting from the beginning. I tried to explain about finding the brownies in Summer's room and eating 3 of them for breakfast because I was hungry and they looked normal. But my thoughts kept sliding sideways, and I'd lose track of what I was saying mid-sentence. She was patient and took notes without rushing me, asking simple follow-up questions when I got confused. She reassured me I wasn't in trouble and this wasn't about punishment, but we needed to contact my parents right away because of mandatory reporting rules. The idea of my dad finding out made my stomach drop worse than the nausea from the drugs. I felt actual terror spike through the fog in my brain. Aaliyah must have seen the panic on my face because she leaned forward and explained this was about my safety, not getting me in trouble. There were laws requiring them to notify parents when minors ingested illegal substances. She made it sound reasonable, but I still felt sick thinking about Dad's reaction. Summer came back in, and Aaliyah asked for our father's contact information. Summer's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, and I could see she'd been crying more out in the hallway. Her face was blotchy and her eyes were puffy. She read off Dad's number in a quiet voice, and Aaliyah wrote it down carefully. Aaliyah thanked her and stepped out to make the call, closing the door softly behind her. The first nurse came back in with supplies for starting an IV. She explained I needed fluids to stay hydrated and help flush my system. The needle pinch felt distant and strange when she inserted it into my arm, like it was happening to someone else's body. I watched the clear fluid start dripping through the tube with this weird, fascinated horror at how slowly each drop fell. Time seemed to move in slow motion, and I couldn't look away from the hypnotic drip, drip, drip of the IV. Summer pulled the plastic chair closer to my bed and sat down with her elbows on her knees. She started apologizing and couldn't seem to stop. The words tumbled out about how the brownies were in her mini-fridge with a label that said, "Do not eat," in red marker. She kept saying she never imagined I'd go in her room, that I never went in her room, that her door was supposed to be off limits and she thought I knew that. Her voice cracked and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I wanted to be angry at her for having those brownies in our house in the first place, for being stupid enough to make drugs and leave them where I could find them. But my brain felt too fuzzy and scared to hold on to anger. The fluorescent lights kept making halos that expanded and contracted. I told her I was hungry this morning and saw chocolate brownies on the top shelf. They looked normal, like the kind Mom used to make before she left. I didn't think to check for labels or ask permission because who labels regular food? Summer made this choking sound and put her face in her hands. The door opened and Aaliyah came back in holding a clipboard. She said our father was on his way and should arrive in about 40 minutes. Then she explained that hospital policy required them to notify law enforcement for drug-related incidents involving minors. A police officer would need to come by to document what happened and make sure I was safe. Summer's head snapped up and her face went white. She started talking really fast about getting arrested and losing her scholarship, about being kicked out of her sorority and getting expelled from college. Her breathing got weird and panicky. Aaliyah tried to reassure her, but Summer kept spiraling. Betsy must have heard the commotion because she appeared in the doorway looking worried. She came in and put her hand on Summer's shoulder and told her to breathe, that it would be okay. But Summer shook her head and said nothing about this was okay. My backpack on the floor started buzzing, then buzzed again, and again. Summer noticed and reached for it, but I said it was my phone. The nurse who'd done my IV came over and gently suggested I avoid screens right now. She explained that bright lights and moving images could make the visual problems worse. My phone kept buzzing inside the backpack. I knew it was probably people from the school asking where I went. Mr. Todsworth had seen Summer drag me out. Everyone in third period had watched. The nurse moved my backpack to the counter across the room so I couldn't reach it easily. The buzzing continued for another minute, then stopped. Summer was crying again, and Betsy was trying to calm her down with limited success. Everything felt too bright and too slow. The clock on the wall showed 11:47, but I couldn't tell if that was right. Time didn't make sense anymore. A knock on the door made everyone freeze. A police officer stepped into the room wearing a dark blue uniform with a badge that caught the light. He introduced himself as Raymond Casey, and his voice was calm. Not scary or aggressive like I expected. He explained he worked with cases involving kids, and his main priority was making sure I was safe and getting proper medical care. He looked at me first and asked how I was feeling. I said weird and scared. He nodded like that made sense. Then he turned to Summer and asked if she could walk him through exactly what happened. He pulled out a small notebook and pen. Summer's voice came out small and shaky as she explained about making the brownies 2 days ago for a party her fraternity was throwing. She described measuring out the mushrooms and mixing them into the batter, how she'd labeled the container clearly and put it in her mini fridge in her room. She talked about coming home last night for a quick visit and leaving the brownies there because she planned to drive back this afternoon. Her voice kept breaking as she described realizing this morning that the container was open and brownies were missing. How she'd panicked and called Betsy and driven straight to my school. Officer Casey wrote everything down without interrupting. When Summer finished, he asked me questions too. Did Summer force me to eat anything? Did she offer me the brownies? Did she know I was going to eat them? I said no to everything. That this was completely my fault for going in her room without permission, for eating her food without asking. That Summer had no idea until she found the empty container. That she rescued me the second she figured out what happened. Officer Casey made notes and nodded. He asked about the label and I admitted I didn't see it because I just grabbed the brownies and ate them fast before school. The doctor came back in with papers in his hand. He said the lab results confirmed psilocybin in my system. The levels were high, which explained why the effects were so intense. He showed the results to Officer Casey and Aaliyah, while Summer and I waited. My heart was beating too fast and I could feel it in my throat. Summer grabbed my hand and squeezed it. Her palm was sweaty. Officer Casey finished reading the lab results and looked up. He said this was definitely serious. But the circumstances pointed to an accident rather than abuse or intentional distribution to a minor. Summer had acted immediately to get me medical help. I'd confirmed she had no idea I would eat the brownies. However, Summer would still face consequences. She was an adult who brought illegal drugs into a home where a minor lived. That violated several laws even though she didn't mean for this to happen. Summer nodded and more tears ran down her face. She said she understood, that she took full responsibility. Officer Casey said he'd need to file a report, and Summer would likely receive a citation. She might have to appear in court. Summer's whole body was shaking now, but she kept nodding. Aaliyah stepped out of the room to make another phone call, and I heard her voice in the hallway saying something about the father arriving soon. My stomach twisted worse than the nausea from the drugs. The door opened, and my dad walked in wearing his work clothes with dust still on his jeans from the construction site. His face looked tight and scary in a way I'd never seen before. The nurse pointed at me, and Dad crossed the room in 3 big steps. He grabbed my face gently and pulled down my lower eyelid to look at my pupils. His hands smelled like sawdust and concrete. He asked if I was hurt anywhere besides the drug effects. I shook my head, and that's when I started crying. Not quiet crying, but the kind where you can't breathe right and your whole chest feels tight. Dad pulled me into a hug, and I could feel how tense his arms were, like he was holding back from squeezing too hard. He kept one hand on the back of my head, and I heard him take this deep, shaky breath. Then he let go and turned to look at Summer. His expression made her press back against the wall like she wanted to disappear into it. Her face went completely white. Officer Casey cleared his throat and introduced himself to Dad. He shook Dad's hand and explained he was there because hospital policy required law enforcement notification for minors and controlled substances. Dad nodded once and his jaw was clenched, so tight I could see the muscles working. Aaliyah came back in and introduced herself as the social worker assigned to my case. The doctor returned with more papers in his hands. Everyone started talking at once and Dad held up one hand. He said he needed to understand exactly what happened from the beginning. Officer Casey went first and walked through the timeline based on Summer's statement and my confirmation. He explained about the brownies being made for a party, about them being labeled and stored in Summer's room, about me eating them without permission or knowledge of what they contained, about Summer's immediate response to get me medical help. Dad listened without interrupting, but his hands were in fists at his sides. Aaliyah explained the social services perspective and why she was involved. The doctor showed Dad my lab results and the confirmed presence of psilocybin. Dad asked how much I'd ingested. The doctor said based on my reported consumption of 3 brownies and the blood levels, it was a significant dose for someone my size with no tolerance. Dad's face got even tighter. He asked about peak effects and how long this would last. The doctor said I was probably approaching peak now, and effects could continue for 6 to 8 hours total. Dad asked about long-term risks, brain damage, lasting effects, psychological problems. The doctor said for a single exposure in an otherwise healthy teen, full recovery was expected. No permanent physical damage to the brain. The main concerns were monitoring me through the peak period to prevent injury or dangerous behavior, and addressing the psychological impact of the experience. Dad turned to Summer and asked her to explain her side. Summer's voice came out small and broken as she repeated everything about making the brownies for her fraternity party. About labeling the container, about storing it in her mini fridge, about coming home for a quick visit and leaving them there because she was driving back today, about finding the empty container this morning and panicking, about calling Betsy and racing to my school. Dad asked why she had drugs at all. Summer said it was for a party, that people at college did this kind of thing. Dad's voice went cold when he said that didn't make it legal or safe. Officer Casey stepped in and explained the legal situation. He said based on the circumstances and evidence, Summer would receive a citation for possession of a controlled substance and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. She'd have to appear in municipal court, but he wasn't arresting her given the accidental nature and her immediate action to get me help. The doctor added that Summer's quick response probably prevented a much worse outcome. Officer Casey pulled out his citation book and started filling it out. The sound of his pen scratching on the paper seemed really loud. Summer was crying again silently with tears running down her face. Officer Casey finished writing and tore the citation from the book. He handed it to Summer and explained the court date was listed at the bottom. She needed to appear, or a warrant would be issued. Summer took the paper with both hands, shaking so bad she almost dropped it. She looked at Dad and started to say she was sorry. Dad cut her off with a sharp hand gesture. He said they would discuss this at home after we dealt with the immediate medical situation. His voice had no emotion in it at all, which was somehow scarier than if he'd been yelling. Aaliyah pulled a folder from her bag and handed papers to Dad. She said these were resources about substance exposure in minors, support groups, counseling services. She recommended follow-up counseling for both me and Summer. She said this needed to be about learning and prevention, not just punishment. Dad took the papers and nodded. Someone knocked on the door and a woman in business clothes came in. She introduced herself as being from the hospital billing department. She said she needed to discuss costs and insurance coverage. Dad's face went even tighter. The woman explained that the ER visit, labs, monitoring, and social services consultation would total several $1,000s. She said our insurance might not cover all of it since it involved illegal substances. There could be significant out-of-pocket expenses. Dad asked how much. The woman said she'd need to run the final numbers, but probably $4,000 to $6,000 after insurance. Dad closed his eyes for a second. Summer made this choking sound and said she'd pay for it. That this was her fault. Dad told her to be quiet. The billing woman said she'd send the final statement in a few weeks, and they had payment plan options. She left, and the room felt even smaller. Summer's phone started ringing in her purse. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. Her face went even more pale, if that was possible. She answered and said hello in this tiny voice. I could hear a woman's voice on the other end asking where Summer was, why she'd missed chapter meeting. Summer explained she was at the hospital with a family emergency. The voice on the phone changed from annoyed to concerned and started asking questions. Summer looked at Dad helplessly. Dad held out his hand for the phone. Summer gave it to him. Dad identified himself as Summer's father and explained there was a serious family emergency involving her younger brother. He said Summer had responded appropriately, but there would be consequences to discuss. The voice asked if everyone was okay. Dad said we would be, but this was a significant situation. The voice said she was the sorority house manager, and they'd need to discuss this with campus conduct given the circumstances. Dad said he understood and Summer would be in touch tomorrow. He ended the call and handed the phone back to Summer. Dad's phone started buzzing in his pocket, and he pulled it out to check the screen. He answered, and I heard him say my school's name. The woman on the other end was asking about my absence and whether I'd be back tomorrow. Dad explained I was at the hospital and would be out for at least the rest of the week. Her voice got louder, asking what happened and if this was serious. Dad said it was a medical emergency, and he'd provide documentation when I returned to class. She wanted more details about the nature of the emergency. Dad's jaw tightened, and he said it was a private medical matter involving accidental ingestion of a substance, and we were handling it with doctors and authorities. The woman went quiet for a second, then said the school would need a full report, and there might be mandatory counseling requirements. Dad agreed to discuss it next week and ended the call. He looked at me and then at Summer with this expression that made my stomach hurt worse than the nausea. The nurse came back in to check my vitals again and asked how I was feeling. Everything was getting more intense instead of better. The walls seemed to pulse with my heartbeat. The beeping from the monitor sounded like it was echoing in a cave. Colors were so bright they almost hurt to look at. I told the nurse things were getting worse, and she nodded like she expected that. She said we were around hour 4, which was usually when the effects peaked. She pulled a chair closer to my bed and sat down. She said she was going to stay with me through the worst of it and keep reminding me this was temporary, and I was safe. The clock on the wall had numbers that seemed to melt and reform. I couldn't tell if minutes were passing or hours. Sound felt weird, like everything had an echo that shouldn't be there. Dad moved his chair right next to my bed and took my hand. His hand felt solid and real when everything else felt like it was shifting. Summer was still in the corner looking miserable. I saw her wipe her eyes with her sleeve. She kept staring at the floor and her shoulders were shaking. The nurse asked me questions every few minutes to make sure I was still aware of where I was and who was with me. My answers felt slow, like my brain had to work extra hard to form words. Dad squeezed my hand and said he was right here and wasn't going anywhere. Time did something strange where I'd blink, and suddenly it felt like an hour passed, but the clock only showed 10 minutes. The fluorescent lights left trails when I moved my eyes. The texture of the hospital blanket felt like I could feel every single thread. My heart was beating, so hard I could see my chest moving. The nurse kept her voice calm and steady, reminding me over and over that this would pass, and I was monitored and safe. Summer made a choking sound, and I looked over to see her crying quietly with her face in her hands. Dad didn't look at her. He just kept his attention on me and kept holding my hand. The doctor came back in and checked my chart and examined my pupils again. He asked the nurse how I was handling the peak, and she reported my vitals were stable even though I was clearly distressed. He said as long as my heart rate and blood pressure stayed in acceptable ranges, we'd continue monitoring without intervention. Another hour crawled by with the nurse talking to me, and Dad holding my hand, and Summer crying in the corner. Finally, the intensity started to ease just a little bit. Colors weren't quite as overwhelming. Sounds started to feel more normal. The nurse noticed the change and said we were probably past the worst of it. She said the next few hours would be gradual improvement, but I'd still feel strange for a while. The doctor came back around 6 in the evening and said he was clearing me for discharge. Dad sat up straighter and asked what we needed to do at home. The doctor said Dad had to check on me every single hour through the night, keep me drinking water, bring me back immediately if I showed any signs of serious distress or if the effects didn't go away by morning. He handed Dad a paper with warning signs to watch for. Dad read it carefully and asked questions about each item. The nurse helped me into a wheelchair even though I said I could walk. She said it was hospital policy. Dad pushed me through the hallways that still looked a bit too bright and shiny. Summer followed behind us carrying my backpack and her purse. Nobody talked. We got to the parking lot and Dad helped me into his truck. Summer stood there looking lost until Dad told her to follow us home in her car. The drive home was awful. I kept my eyes closed because every streetlight we passed left long trails of light that made me dizzy. The motion of the truck felt wrong, like we were moving too fast, even though Dad was driving carefully. I heard Summer's car behind us the whole way. Dad didn't turn on the radio. The silence felt heavy and tense. When we pulled into our driveway, I opened my eyes and our house looked strange, like I was seeing it for the first time. Dad helped me inside and straight to the couch. He brought me a big glass of water and a sleeve of crackers and put a bucket on the floor next to me. He said the rules clearly. No locked doors anywhere in the house. No food or drinks unless he brought them to me. Summer was not allowed in my space tonight. His voice was flat and cold when he said that last part. Summer had come in behind us and I heard her make a small hurt sound. Dad told her to go to her room. She started to say something and Dad cut her off with a hand gesture. He said we would talk tomorrow when I was sober and rested. Summer went upstairs and I heard her door close. Dad sat in the chair across from me and just watched me for a while. I tried to eat a cracker, but my mouth felt dry and weird. The living room was dim because Dad had only turned on one lamp. I felt exhausted, but also wired and strange. Dad brought me another glass of water and told me to drink it slowly. I did, and the cool water felt good going down. My body felt disconnected, like my brain was sending signals, but they were taking too long to reach my arms and legs. Dad set an alarm on his phone and said he'd be checking on me every hour. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but everything felt uncomfortable. The couch cushions were too soft and too hard at the same time. I could hear Summer crying through the wall between the living room and her bedroom. Dad heard it too, but he didn't move or react. He just sat in his chair watching me. I drifted off into something that wasn't quite sleep. I'd wake up confused about where I was and Dad would be there asking me questions. What's your name? Where are you? Who am I? I'd answer and he'd give me more water and tell me to rest. This happened over and over. The clock said 9:30, then 10:15, then 11. Around 10, I heard footsteps on the stairs and Summer appeared in the doorway. She looked terrible with red eyes and messy hair. She started to come into the living room and Dad stood up and blocked her. He said not tonight. They needed to have family discussions tomorrow when I was better. Summer said she just wanted to see if I was okay. Dad said I was monitored and she needed to go back to her room. Summer's face crumpled and she started crying again. She said she was so sorry. Dad's voice stayed flat and hard. He said they would talk tomorrow and she needed to give me space tonight. Summer went back upstairs and I heard her door close, and then more crying through the wall. Dad sat back down and reset his alarm. I felt bad for Summer even though this was her fault. I drifted off again into that weird, not quite sleep state. Every time I woke up, Dad was there. Sometimes he was reading on his phone. Sometimes he was just sitting there watching me. He'd ask his questions and give me water and check the time. By midnight, the visual stuff had mostly stopped. The lamp didn't leave trails anymore when I looked at it. Colors looked normal again. But I still felt disconnected and strange, like my body wasn't quite mine. Dad helped me to the bathroom, and I had to lean on him because my legs felt weak. Back on the couch, he brought me fresh water and another blanket. He said I was doing good and we were through the worst part. His voice was a little less cold when he said it. I managed to actually sleep for a bit, and when I woke up, it was light outside. Morning had come and I felt horrible. My stomach was churning and I was so tired my whole body ached. My head hurt and I felt shaky. Dad was already awake, sitting in his chair. He asked how I felt, and I told him honestly that I felt terrible. He nodded and said that was normal after what my body went through. He called my school and told them I'd be out for the rest of the week. Then he called our family doctor and made an appointment for a follow-up check. He brought me toast and more water. I managed to eat half a piece before my stomach protested. Summer's door opened upstairs and I heard her in the bathroom. Dad stood up and went to make coffee. The smell made my nausea worse and I had to breathe through my mouth. Summer came down the stairs, moving slow like her whole body hurt. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her hair was in a messy bun she probably slept in. She had on the same clothes from yesterday. Dad poured himself coffee and then started making eggs and toast without asking if we wanted any. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the spatula scraping the pan. I stayed on the couch because moving seemed like too much work. Summer sat at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands. Dad plated the food and brought it to the table, along with orange juice and more water for me. He helped me walk to the table and I sat down feeling shaky. The eggs looked okay, but my stomach wasn't sure about food yet. Dad sat down and ate a few bites before he finally spoke. He said we needed to talk about what happens next and what consequences we were all facing. Summer started crying again, but Dad held up his hand and told her to listen first. He explained she had a court date in 2 weeks for the citation officer Casey gave her. She'd also have to deal with her university and probably her sorority since this happened at our house, but involved stuff from her dorm. His voice was flat and tired, like he'd been up all night thinking about this. But then he said, even though her judgment was terrible, she did do the right thing by getting me to the hospital fast instead of trying to hide it or wait it out. That probably saved me from worse effects or complications. Summer nodded and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Dad turned to look at me and his expression got more serious. He said I had a role in this too that we needed to address. I went into Summer's room without permission and ate her food without asking. Yeah, the consequences were way more extreme than normal, but I needed to learn about respecting boundaries and other people's stuff. He asked what I was doing in her room in the first place. I admitted I was looking for my charger and saw the brownies and just took them because I was hungry before school. Dad nodded and said that kind of thinking is exactly what got me into trouble. Taking things that aren't mine without asking. Summer's room is her private space and her food is hers unless she offers it. Dad said we were going to establish some new rules for everyone in the house. All medications and anything that could be dangerous gets locked in his bedroom from now on. All food in the fridge and pantry gets labeled with names so we know what belongs to who. And the big rule is we ask before taking anything that isn't explicitly ours. These rules apply to everyone, not just me. He looked at Summer when he said that part. She nodded and said that was fair. Dad finished his eggs and took his plate to the sink. He said Summer needed to go back to her dorm today and figure out her university situation. I needed to rest and recover and we'd deal with my school stuff when I was feeling better. The conversation was over and we all just sat there for a minute. Then the mail came through the slot in the front door. Summer got up to check it and came back holding a big envelope with her university's logo on it. Her hands started shaking as she opened it. She pulled out an official letter and read it with her face getting paler. Dad asked what it said. Summer's voice was quiet when she read that she had to meet with the campus conduct officer within 48 hours. She was placed on interim restrictions, including no social events and no access to her sorority house until their investigation was done. Dad told her to call and schedule that meeting right now. Summer went upstairs to get her phone, and I heard her talking to someone confirming an appointment for tomorrow afternoon. She came back down and started packing her stuff to leave. Dad walked her to her car and they talked outside for a few minutes. I watched through the window and saw Summer crying and Dad hugging her before she drove away. The house felt empty and quiet after she left. Dad came back in and helped me to the couch. He said I should try to sleep more and he'd keep checking on me. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't really come. My phone rang around lunchtime and Dad answered it. He talked to someone for a while using his serious voice. When he hung up, he told me that was my school counselor. She wanted me to come in for a meeting when I went back to the school. Dad said he'd be coming to that meeting too to talk about what happened and what support I might need to catch up on work I missed. I felt embarrassed thinking about facing my counselor and telling her about the mushroom brownies. But Dad said it was required and we'd get through it together. The next 2 weeks dragged by. I went back to the school after 3 days and everyone stared at me in the hallways. Some kids asked what happened and I just said I got sick. My close friends knew more because rumors spread fast. A couple guys made jokes about me being a druggie or asked if I had any more shrooms to share. That made me feel terrible because it wasn't like I chose to take them. The meeting with my counselor was awkward. She and Dad talked about the incident, and she explained the school had to take it seriously, even though it was accidental. She asked me questions about how I was doing mentally and physically. I told her I was okay, just embarrassed and trying to move on. She said that was normal and gave Dad some papers about drug education resources. Summer texted me a few times, but I didn't really know what to say back. She was dealing with her own stuff at university, and I was dealing with mine at the school. The court date finally came on a Wednesday morning. Dad picked me up from the school early, and we drove to the municipal courthouse downtown. Summer met us there looking nervous in a dress I'd never seen her wear before. We had to go through security, and then wait in a big room with lots of other people. When they called Summer's name, we all went into the courtroom. The judge was an older woman with gray hair and reading glasses. She looked over the police report and hospital records while we sat in the front row. Then she asked Summer to approach and explain what happened. Summer told the whole story about making the brownies for a party and storing them in her room and me taking them by accident. She said she took full responsibility for having illegal substances in a house with a minor. The judge asked Dad and me questions too about whether this was really an accident and whether Summer had a history of drug problems. Dad explained Summer made a bad choice, but she immediately got me medical help and cooperated fully with police and hospital staff. I confirmed it was totally an accident, and Summer didn't know I'd taken them until it was too late. The judge looked at all of us for a long moment. Then she said given the circumstances and Summer's clean record, she was sentencing her to a diversion program. Summer would have to complete drug education classes, do community service hours, and check in regularly with a probation officer. If she completed everything successfully within 6 months, the charges would be dismissed from her record. Summer thanked the judge and we left the courtroom. In the parking lot, Summer hugged Dad and me and said she'd do whatever it took to make this right. A few days later, Summer called to say her sorority had made their decision. They put her on probation for the semester, which meant no social privileges and no party planning responsibilities. But they were letting her stay a member as long as she completed extra educational requirements about substance safety. She sounded relieved it wasn't worse. My school called Dad in for another meeting and told us I had to attend drug awareness sessions with the counselor. I also had to write a reflection paper about decision-making and consequences. It was embarrassing having to do this stuff, but I understood why they were taking it seriously. The counselor sessions were actually okay. She didn't judge me, and we talked about thinking before acting and respecting boundaries. Writing the paper was harder because I had to really think about my choices and what I learned. A few days after finishing the paper, a thick envelope arrived in the mail addressed to Dad. I was doing homework at the kitchen table when he opened it, and his face went completely white. He sat down hard in the chair and spread out the papers in front of him. The hospital bill showed nearly $8,000 even after insurance covered their part. Dad rubbed his face with both hands and then called the billing department to set up a payment plan. I heard him on the phone explaining that he could manage $200 a month and asking if that would work. Summer came home from class that afternoon, and Dad showed her the bill without saying anything. She stared at the numbers for a long time before asking how much she owed. Dad told her she'd contribute what she could from her part-time job at the campus bookstore. Summer nodded and said she'd give him $300 a month, which was basically her entire paycheck after books and gas. The guilt on her face made my stomach hurt, but I knew she needed to help fix this. 3 weeks went by with Summer and me barely talking except for basic stuff like passing the remote or asking about homework. Dad was always around, so we never really had a chance to talk alone. Then one Saturday, Dad had to go check on a construction site, and Summer asked if I wanted to get pizza with her. We drove to this place near our house and ordered a large pepperoni. Sitting in the booth felt weird and awkward at first. Summer started apologizing again, and I could tell she'd been thinking about what to say for a while. She said she was so sorry for being careless and for not keeping dangerous stuff away from me. I told her I was sorry too for going in her room and taking her food without asking. Neither of us could have known what would happen, but we both made mistakes that led to everything. Summer's eyes got watery, and she said she felt terrible every single day thinking about how scared I must have been in the hospital. I admitted it was really scary, but also that she probably saved my life by getting me there so fast. We spent the next hour talking about boundaries and trust and how we needed to be more careful going forward. Summer promised she wouldn't keep anything potentially dangerous at the house anymore and would store everything at her dorm where I couldn't accidentally get into it. I promised I would always ask before taking anything that wasn't mine, even if it seemed like just regular food. We agreed to communicate better about stuff instead of assuming things would be fine. The conversation felt important and real in a way our relationship hadn't been before. Summer paid for the pizza with money from her bookstore job, and we drove home feeling like maybe we could fix things between us. Back at the school, things got complicated in a different way. Somehow, rumors spread about what happened, and a few kids started making jokes. In the hallway between classes, this guy Jake called me Shroom Boy and asked if I was seeing pink elephants. His friends laughed, and I felt my face get hot with embarrassment. Another kid asked if I was a druggie now and if I could hook him up. The jokes stung even though I knew they were stupid and based on rumors. My real friends pulled me aside during lunch and asked if I was okay. They said they heard something happen but didn't believe the rumors about me doing drugs on purpose. I explained it was a total accident and really scary, and they told me not to worry about the idiots making jokes. Having people who actually cared and didn't judge me helped more than I expected. The school counselor set up regular meetings for me to talk about everything. At first, I didn't want to go because it felt embarrassing to need counseling over something so stupid. The counselor was actually pretty cool, though, and didn't make me feel bad about any of it. She let me talk about the anxiety I felt going back to the school and dealing with people knowing something really personal and embarrassing about me. I told her about the jokes and the stares and how I kept worrying people thought I was some kind of drug user. She helped me work through those feelings and reminded me that what other people thought didn't change the truth about what really happened. Talking to someone outside my family who didn't judge me made it easier to process everything. After a few sessions, I started feeling less anxious about the whole situation. Dad scheduled my follow-up appointment with our family doctor to make sure everything was okay long-term. The doctor did a full exam and ran some blood tests to check my liver and other stuff. When the results came back, she said I showed no lasting physical effects from the incident, which was a huge relief. She used the appointment to talk to me about substances and safety and making informed choices as I got older. The doctor explained that even though what happened was an accident, it was important I understood the risks involved with different substances. She gave me information about how drugs affect developing brains and why it mattered to be careful. The whole conversation felt educational instead of preachy, which made it easier to actually listen and learn something. Summer completed her first month of community service at a local food bank. She had to work there every Saturday morning sorting donations and packing boxes for families. I asked Dad if I could volunteer to help her one weekend. We drove there together and spent 4 hours organizing canned goods and loading boxes into people's cars. Working side by side on something positive felt good after all the negative stuff. Summer introduced me to the coordinator and some of the other volunteers. We didn't talk much while we worked, but being there together doing something helpful felt like a small step toward fixing our relationship. On the drive home, Summer thanked me for coming and said it meant a lot to have me there supporting her. Officer Casey called Dad one evening to check in on how everything was going. I was in the living room doing homework and could hear Dad's side of the conversation. Dad told him I was doing well in the school and seemed to be recovering emotionally from the whole experience. He confirmed that Summer was meeting all her diversion program requirements and staying out of trouble. Officer Casey asked a few more questions about our family situation and whether we needed any additional resources or support. Dad said we were managing okay and working through the consequences responsibly. The call lasted about 15 minutes, and when Dad hung up, he looked relieved that the check-in went smoothly. 2 months after everything happened, we had a family dinner that almost felt normal. Dad made spaghetti, and we all sat at the table together without the heavy tension that had been there for weeks. Summer told a funny story about one of her professors, and Dad talked about a project at work. I mentioned getting a good grade on my history test. At one point, Dad made a careful joke about checking food labels before eating anything, and we all kind of laughed in this uncomfortable but not completely terrible way. The tension had eased into something more manageable. We were adjusting to new routines and finding our way back to feeling like a family again, instead of 3 people walking on eggshells around each other. Things kept getting better slowly over the next few weeks. I was doing better in the school and catching up on the work I missed. Summer was on track to complete her diversion program successfully, and her grades hadn't suffered too much from everything. Dad relaxed some of the stricter rules he'd put in place once we proved we learned from the experience. Life wasn't perfect and some awkwardness remained, but we were moving forward as a family with clearer boundaries and better communication. The whole thing taught me to think before acting and respect other people's space and belongings. I learned that even when things go terribly wrong, the people who love you will show up to help you through it. Summer and I had a deeper understanding of each other now. We both made mistakes, but we also both tried to make things right. Dad showed us that consequences matter, but so does forgiveness and moving forward. Our family came out of this different from before, maybe not better or worse, just different in ways that mattered. That is how it went for me. But now I want to know what you think. Would you have done the same thing or something totally different? Leave a comment and let's see how many different takes we can get. I will be reading through them later.